Still to come and to be realized. Being attuned to the broad to work on Ms. Antonia Pogema. She's an Austrian physicist, philosopher, and prominent animal rights activist. He was born in Vienna. He obtained diplomas in mathematics, astronomy from the University of Vienna, and his PhD in physics from the University of Heidelberg. In 2005, he achieved also a PhD in philosophy in the field of animal ethics. He worked for 12 years as a lecturer and researcher at the Universities of Vienna, Heidelberg, and Cambridge, before leaving academia in 1997 to become a full-time animal rights advocate. He co-founded the Austrian Vegan Society in 1999 and has been president of the Austrian Association Against Animal Factors, Keramik and Tierfabriken, since 2002. The philosopher Peter Singer has called Balluch one of the foremost spokesmen in the worldwide animal rights movement for pursuing the non-violent democratic road to reform. In the years from 1986 to 1987, Balluch published 14 works in the fields of physics and astronomy. His most notable works in the field of animal ethics are now the book from 2011, Tierschützer, Staatsfeind und Entfängen von Polizei und Justiz. Then from 2009, Widerstand der Demokratiezivierung, Wirksam und konfrontative Kampagnen. This is the book that has been published in Slovenia. You can buy it outside and perhaps can ask the author to sign it. And there is the third book from 2005, Die Kontinuität von Bewusstsein, das naturwissenschaftliche Argument für Tierrechte. So please.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to your conference. I have been involved and thinking about environmentalism, environmental movement since the late 1970s, so quite a long while, and it was not, at least in Austria, until the mid-1980s when the animal movement emancipated itself from the environment, became a topic on its own, with its own structures and its own demands. And social movements of that kind seem to me to always suffer in some or other of this principled discrepancy between a reformist, realistic attitude of change and of the way society should be running versus a fundamentalist, idealistic attitude. We call it abolitionism versus reformism. For me, most notably, the German Green movement had this very strong split between the Fundis and the Realos a few decades ago, and it is always very hard to get along and find a solution. And I want to talk about this conflict, and I want to talk about how this could be possibly overcome and what it actually means. Here I have plotted between, if you want, abolitionism versus reformism, or rights versus welfare. They both are very distinct philosophical ideas. I would trace back to the 18th century, the Enlightenment era, where a number of thinkers were firstly talking about the concept of suffering of animals, of empathy of animals towards animals, and of supporting doing the least necessary damage to them, or expose them to the least necessary suffering. Animal rights, on the other hand, has the first thinkers who really clearly made this point in distinction to animal welfare, and also tried to promote it as a social issue in the late 19th century. Henry sold, for example, his book Animal Rights in Relation to Social Progress. The first groups actually promoting it socially you will find the mid-19th century. In Austria, it's the Viennese Animal Protection Society from 1846, that is the first one. And about that time, it surfaced everywhere. Whereas in animal rights, it took a lot longer. In England, it was the end of the 19th century, but in Austria, it took till the 1980s, really, before groups were formed who actually specifically espoused the animal rights idea. What have been achieved, if you want, maybe as markers we can look at laws. Are there any animal welfare laws? Yes, they are. The first laws came approximately at the same time as the first animal welfare groups became active in the mid-19th century. Those were very typically animal welfare laws in England in the beginning of the 19th century, a law to ban too cruel treatment of horses, so you were allowed to hit a horse but not too hard. And that is a sort of the epitome of an animal welfare law. Whereas for animal rights there is none. There is not a single law so far that actually gives rights to animals, especially great ape. Innovation that drives people towards animal rights driven by the feelings for justice. You think deserve a just treatment. And that could be very different from empathy, because with empathy generally you find animal welfarists, you find generally working with animals, living with animals, loving animals. Whereas people who promote animal rights don't necessarily do that. They might even don't want to have anything to do with animals, but they still feel that they deserve justice. The aim or the goal is to minimize suffering with animal welfare. People say, yes, there is suffering, but it's necessary, maybe also meat eating necessary, but we reduce the suffering to a minimum. Versus in animal rights, the idea is to promote autonomy for those beings. The first debate would be, do they actually have autonomy? Are they capable of autonomy? Which would be, if you want, another issue. I promote this idea that consciousness essentially comes with autonomy. The decision to be able to decide. And this is the aim of animal rights, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with minimizing suffering, because if you act autonomously, that might well mean that you suffer a lot more. So one example that has been actually debated is whether you should go into the woods and support wild living animals against cold weather. Animal welfare people might well say you should do that. Hunters sometimes argue you need to shoot them before they freeze or before they starve. Whereas the animal rights position generally is that you should leave those autonomously living creatures in the wild autonomously. If they suffer, then they suffer. And if they die of cold or if they suffer in the cold, then be it. But this is the basic principle of justice says this is their right to live autonomously, even if that means more suffering. One other example, I had recently debates with fur farming community and especially scientists promoting it. Fur farming has been banned in Austria since 1998, but this biologist argued that fur farming is less suffering for the fur-bearing animals in the cages than the wild. In the wild, they're constantly fighting to survive. They need to fight possible predators, they need to catch prey, and they constantly have this trouble, whereas in the cage they don't have any problems. They just stay there, and if they're not used to anything else, it might mean they don't really suffer stress, and so they don't suffer. So here again you see a very strong discrepancy. The autonomy goal that would promote these animals to be in the wild, even if it means hardship, whereas the welfarist might say keep them without touch to the wild, without connection to the wild, as long as they don't suffer. So animal welfare doesn't question the use of animals for human benefit in principle. They say you can use them, but you just minimize the suffering if you use them. Whereas animal rights says using non-human animals for human purposes is in principle wrong, as long as the individual animal doesn't have an advantage of this. So it must be in the advantage of each and every individual. What do these social movements do actively? The animal welfare is mostly concerned with animal suffering. Indeed, of the about 200 animal societies in Austria, 99% I'd say are concerned with active help of animals in need. This is the most important for them. Like homeless animals, stray animals, this is where this idea comes from, and all these societies were founded on the basis of helping stray animals or helping even farmed animals that haven't got a place to stay. Whereas animal rights is mostly politically active, to change attitudes, to change maybe the system, especially to change the personal attitude of people towards veganism and away from usage of animals. There is a very clear distinction between humans and non-humans in society, and this distinction goes down, maybe I'd say it has its roots in the Enlightening era, and it is cemented in a law that comes from this period. And it very clearly distinguishes between persons and property, and it says humans are persons and animals are property. And this principal distinction is untouched by the animal welfare ideology, whereas animal rights is demanding to completely change that. The one basic animal rights demand might be to extend personhood, for example, to great apes, so that they too have basic rights, and even if it's only the right to have a protection law being executed, because there's many fundamental differences if you are considered a property or if you're considered a person, obviously, and one of them is that you cannot demand the execution of laws if you're property. So if somebody in front of you mistreats an animal, and even if that's illegal, you're not allowed to intervene, because it's none of your business, essentially. You can call the police, but you can't intervene. Whereas if a person is being attacked, and there is a personal rights being broken, then you can intervene on behalf of this person, even breaking other laws. The human-animal relation, in essence, stays the same from the animal welfare position, where it's supposed to be completely new from the animal rights position. And you can see also that this obviously has an attraction because if you wanna, if people are willing to involve time and maybe even their lives, devote their lives to something, then that is often connected to a revolutionary idea, to a completely new. Let's just rip everything down and make everything completely new. And so this is often where this conflict arises then, from people who come with this attitude of completely changing the world, and obviously others who think, let's leave it as it is because it's working at least, let's adjust it only. The self-definition of animal welfare is that it's a social activity, whereas animal rights political. Often if you talk to people who come from the welfarist tradition, they will completely denounce political activity. They say this is nothing to do with political. They are just acting good, whereas animal rights people acting just. And acting good is not necessarily something you can ask of others. We say only good people act good, so you can't necessarily say you have to act good. Whereas if you want justice, then you can demand this from others. So you see, this position very soon demands changes from society and from each and every single individual. Whereas this not necessarily does that. It says if you, maybe with some gains in religion or maybe with some gains of ethical feelings, but generally it's a matter of acting good, which is not something you necessarily ask of others. And or you can only ask them to, but you can't sort of force them to, whereas here you can force them with laws, for example. And killing, especially, is a distinction between the two philosophies. The one is saying that it doesn't matter at all. The animal welfare philosophy is only concerned with suffering. If the killing is done in a painless way, it is no matter whatsoever. So killing an animal that is, before it suffers, before it's stray animals, for example, might just be killed by animal welfarists because they feel there is no damage done, as long as they don't suffer. Whereas for the rightist position, this is the worst thing you can do, because pain or being caught, being in a cage, restricts someone's autonomy, but the death completely eradicates it. So it's the worst thing you can do, even if painlessly killing somebody, it's the worst thing you can do. So if you look at this, you might think there is no possibility that these philosophies can work together, and one can also understand why these philosophies have such a strong antipathy towards each other. But then if you look how animal welfare has been developed in the last 160 years in Austria as an example, because I've been active there for the last 14 years and been part of getting these laws established, then you see that there is a number of modern animal welfare laws that actually go beyond the classic philosophy of animal welfare. You have, for example, a law, paragraph section 6 of the Animal Protection Act, that says dogs and cats cannot be used to produce meat or fur. In principle, they can't be used. They can't be used even if they're treated nicely, if they live free range, and if they're killed painlessly suddenly. They cannot be used full stop. Products like meat and fur are not worth killing a dog or a cat. And if you want, that is going beyond animal welfare. It's not animal rights because it doesn't give dogs and cats rights, because again, these creatures can be killed by someone, and the only thing you can do is, for meat and fur, the only thing you can do is call police. There is no right of them that they could, or someone on their behalf could appeal to the Supreme Court and demand that the law being upheld. All these things don't work, so they are still not persons, they still don't have rights. They have nil rights, not a single one, but there is this protection law that actually goes beyond animal welfare. Similarly, the ban on fur farming, because the ban on fur farming says fur farming is banned in whatever way, full stop, even if you have whatever 50,000 square kilometers per creature. It is not enough, because seemingly, so the society got as far as deciding that fur as a product is not worth killing, even painlessly, and keeping, even in a very large enclosure, any fur-bearing animal. Similarly, a ban on wild animals in circuses. Again, you cannot use elephants, say, in a circus, full stop, even if they're very nicely treated and everything's fine. And then in 2006 came the ban on ape experiments, which includes gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gibbons. And this ban says, this is in another law, in the law governing the experiments on animals, and this section 3.6 says explicitly it is not allowed to use an ape in any way, even bending its little finger, in any way, even if the ape doesn't suffer, if it is not as an advantage for this individual. So you cannot use an ape in any way if it's not for his or her own advantage. And that's going pretty far towards rights, even if it isn't rights yet, but it is not welfare anymore, because, yeah, as I said, it is not a matter of using them, okay, but in a painless and as friendly as possible way. There are also other principled laws that have set new directions that actually gear towards changing human-animal relation. On the tabula before, I argued that welfare is not concerned with changing the human-animal relation in itself. But these laws do. Section 285A in the General Civil Law Code in Austria now says animals are not things. Sadly, in the next sentence it says, but they can be treated as such until there is something else decided. So you see, we are not there at all, because animals can be either things or persons, and they are not things. You would conclude they are persons, but they are not. It says that unless stated otherwise, they can be still treated as things. And I personally have tried to use this law in a number of occasions in order to find out how judges interpret this law, because there is a general rule that says you cannot have laws that actually don't say anything. So what does this law say? What does this law tell us? What is it actually, what does it forbid, or what does it promote in the jurisdiction? And so far I haven't found anything that it says, because the judges that have used this law all said they considered a null law, a law that actually doesn't say anything. Okay, so again we see there is a law, there is a new law, there is a direction, but that goes definitely beyond animal welfare, but it is far from animal rights. Similarly, in the Constitution there is a clause, protection of life and well-being of animals is an aim of society. And There it says the life of animals, protection of the life of animals, and that's again beyond simple welfare. And also there's a number of laws regarding killing. Section 6 of the Animal Welfare Act says there's a ban on killing animals for no good reason, even if completely painless. And the interesting thing of this law is it concerns all animals. That means including insects or spiders. This law actually says you cannot kill a spider because it bothers you. There must be a good reason, whatever a good reason is, and maybe the spider, and you will quickly find one. But seemingly a good reason is if you want to eat them, if they are not dogs or cats. So obviously there's still this rubber clause that you can move around, but again we have a statement, a societal statement that goes beyond animal welfare. You should not kill an animal. It doesn't say the word painless or with pain in this law, it just says killing, full stop. So killing has become an ethical concern of society. And one example of that is actually the ape experiments that I referred to before. In Austria in the 1970s, a new primate research center was established near Vienna with lots of apes, chimpanzees being illegally, as I say, as it turned out, imported sounds nice, abducted actually from Africa. And they were experimented on, more than 50 of them, until 1997, when these experiments were stopped. In 1999, it was decided that these animals should be rehabilitated. And that's an interesting aspect because this law actually forbids the vivisection laboratory to kill these apes. They are not useful anymore, so let's kill them. No, this is illegal. You must rehabilitate them. So the lab eventually had to invest a lot of money to build an outside enclosure where these apes now live. So, and essentially, in practice, this law also bans, in the meantime, also shelters that kill animals. So stray animals cannot be killed anymore because they don't find a home, because the courts of law consider that not a good reason. That's where we have arrived. Animal welfare started with doing exactly that, and the law now forbids exactly that for animal welfare reasons, so we see we've come beyond it. And even the criminal code in Austria says there's a ban on killing, although it doesn't refer to insects or anyone anymore, but vertebrates. It says vertebrates. So it's a criminal offense to kill any vertebrate, including mice and rats, for no good reason, in whatever painless way you want. So you see, there is a development, and now I would have a conjecture in order to try to bring these two together, welfare and rights, and this conjecture I'd call continuum of probabilities, because it provides, although these philosophical ideas are miles apart, it provides politically a continuum, in which I start on the left with an arbitrary use of animals, and then an indirect protection. These were the first animal welfare laws in Austria that said you are not allowed to abuse an animal as long as the public doesn't see it, and if the public sees it, the public isn't offended. So obviously it was a lot of protected humans from being offended and not the individual animals themselves. So it's the mildest form of animal welfare you can think of, the indirect protection, which can then change to direct minimal protection, which is the law of beating horses too much. It actually says too much, whatever too much is, but it means you can beat them, but not too much, in order to protect themselves. Then we can have a switch from the minimal protection to a relevant protection, so that really restricts practical dealings with animals, but of economically irrelevant animals. This is always the first step that is possible. Then you have a relevant restriction of the economic use of animals. Example, the fur farm ban. There were fur farms. There were in the late 80s, there were 70 fur farms in Austria, and they had some economic, obviously, contribution, and they were all closed. So there was a relevant restriction of economy. And then you could go further to free range, so that you only allow free range farming. This would be still clearly animal welfare. But then you can have also a ban on killing, which is basically one step further. And as I said, in a number of areas in the Animal Welfare Code, we have reached that step of a ban on killing. And then you could go further to weak rights, like Mary Midgley proposed, which are rights that are there if they are not needed. And if they are needed, like if the animal needs protections, then he or she loses his or her rights. So they are actually not really there to protect them, but they are there if basically nobody looks. So this is the mildest form of rights you might have. And then the weakest form of real rights, so unbreakable rights, is the right to have the animal welfare law enacted. This is a stage that we have also tried to reach recently in our court case for the chimpanzee Matthew Pan. He's one of these chimps who actually was supposed to be vivisected on in this lab that I told you before, but he was taken in by the customs at the airport because he was his abduction contravened not an Animal Rights or Human Rights Act, but contravened the CITES agreement. So it was against the species protection. And so he was taken in by customs and then given to his shelter. Then the vivisection lab tried to get him back, and the High Court ruled they have to give him back. If the vivisection lab pays the fine, then they can have him. And people defended him physically. So the animal advocates just stood in the way, hundreds of them, and they couldn't take this ape into the lab. So he survived in a shelter, and then the shelter went bankrupt. And when this happened, we tried to apply for a personhood status on the already existing laws in order to give him, Matthew Pan, the status of a person, but with no additional rights. So we didn't demand a change in law, we just demanded an interpretational change of the existing law, saying that he's actually a person, because we argued two ways, but maybe it doesn't need to concern us here, but the main argument came from arguing biologically that human is not a species, but a genus, and they belong to the same genus. So they should be considered humans, and as such should be considered persons. And what that would have done is that he would have been a rights bearer with no additional rights, but a rights bearer. And a rights bearer means that you can start procedures against anyone, like, for example, someone who tries to abuse you against the law. So they can force police to execute the animal welfare law, but they can also own property. Like you, instead of donating to the shelter that was about to go bankrupt, you could donate to the ape himself, and he himself could then finance his enclosure and and gather money himself. And so that was eventually this project failed. It was too early days, if you want. We brought it all the way to the European Courts of Human Rights, and they considered that not a human rights issue because they didn't. Well, they said it's not nothing to do with me, basically. The higher courts all did not look at the argument, which might also be a good sign, because they feel that the argument is too vague for them, but they considered me as not having legal standing. They said, it's nothing to do with me, so if I apply, I have no legal standing, and they sent the court case back without actually looking at the content. So that was at the end of it. Actually, in the USA, they did on our case, as triggered by our case, which had news headlines all across the world, and they did in some big newspaper vote on whether people consider apes to be right bearers or persons, and 1/3 said yes and 2/3 said no. So if that's the case, then we are on the verge of, if you want, having a first animal rights law in the near future. Then you could switch to basic rights, so not just the personhood rights, but the basic rights like of protection of life and liberty for some animals. This is this GAP project. And then you could have basic rights for all animals, and then you could even go one step further and have an equal value of life for whatever animal, including humans, that involve. So you see, you have sort of the epitome on the right and the epitome on the left, and then you have a continuum in between those, where you can actually smoothly move from totally distinct philosophical ideas, which seem to have such a gap that you cannot overcome them. Essentially my argument for that is that humans are not rational but social animals, so philosophical big gaps can be stepped over psychologically and therefore politically. Most people who become animal rights minded via animal welfare, that they in some way have been triggered towards empathy towards animals, and then from that they move on to say, why don't they actually deserve justice? So since this is the experience, then it seems that societies might move in the same way as well. And I've here now applied this stability hypothesis, if you want, to society. We have a continuum of animal arbitrary use, animal welfare, animal rights. This is this continuum I just put on. And now my idea is, or what I feel is that this straight line is contorted in society in a way that makes it much more difficult to stay on certain dealings with animals than others. What I mean is, picture this line as, if you want, a table surface with gravity, and humans are little balls. And if you're now on the left up there, so arbitrary usage of animals in today's society, like if you want to organize dog fights, then you will find it's hard to do that because it is socially unacceptable, so that people around you will all disagree, so you will have to do it secretly and not admit to it if you talk with others. And at the same time it's illegal, so you have to look over your shoulder all the time whether the police is not tracing you. So it's a hard thing to sustain this attitude, which means that if you let go, if you don't resist, then you fall down into this trough, which in our society is factory farming, using factory farming animal products and using animal products that have been vivisected on, because this is what you get in the shelves, this is what is the simplest and cheapest thing to do, and this is what nobody questions you if you do. This is just, if you let go, if you have other priorities, then this is where you end up, in this trough. On the other hand, if you move to the right of this continuum, then you maybe decide that you have your welfarist to such an extent that you only want to have free range or organic meat. And then you find it's not as hard as organizing animal fights because it's not illegal and because maybe some people find it even not so strange and weird. But so with getting there to have that accepted as an attitude, but you still have a lot of social problems and maybe financial and maybe practical, because it's hard to find organic meat all the time. If you say you're only eating that, and then you show me the restaurant where you can do that, almost nowhere. And if you are in a normal social group, if you have a sports club and you participate there, and everybody goes out and eating, and then you have to say, no, I'm not participating because they haven't got organic meat. So it is hard, again, because it makes you, it costs you energy to sustain that. Everybody looks at you and you say, yeah, that's my conviction. So if you are troubled, if you divorced just now, or if your parents die or your children, what happens is that the first thing you'll let go is this principle, and you just fall back down in the trough to the normal way of life, the mainstream way of life, the floating, the going with the flow. And this is even worse so if you decide to be vegetarian or even vegan and try to completely accept the animal rights position and actually live there in society. It's not as hard as torturing animals, I'd say, but it is hard on the long run. And this system, therefore, reflects a certain ideological position in this continuum between arbitrary use of animals on the one hand and animal rights on the other. Now, if some people say the main activity of social movement especially of an animal rights movement that wants to change society, is to speak with people, to change the attitude of people. And you can do that with different ways. It starts with vegan, maybe potlucks, where you show people that it's nice to eat that and it tastes well and it's easy to do. And it might be talks on animal rights, it might be whatever it does. And what happens then generally is some people in your audience, symbolized by these plus signs, some people in the audience might agree. And they say, yes, actually, that's true. That's true. So I want to be animal rights minded. But what happens then is that these people find themselves in the system as before, outside the trough. And they suddenly realize that it is actually hard, especially if they're isolated and not within social groups that have the same idea. So what happens, especially with big media scares, this happens that many people suddenly decide, yes, we want to live without meat, for example, or without, sometimes without specific kinds of meat, or with whatever else, especially the live animal transport films that were shown in television. And then what happens is that many people decide to change how they live, and then it isn't sustainable. So what you need to do, or what people do, what the social justice movement does, is it builds infrastructures like a vegan society somewhere in society, and maybe like an animal rights radio, maybe like a weekly potluck, vegan potluck meeting. And if this happens again, that these people change due to being persuaded, they can attach to these structures and keep upstream, keep against the mainstream flow. But eventually, this doesn't help at the end of the day. I have a few ideas, I've put here a few ideas of what supporting structures means. So mainly to have the social help, but also to have an economical infrastructure. It's easy to get organic meat or whatever, then you can sustain living this way much easier. The more films there are about how good it is to eat, not to eat factory farmed meat, the more likely it is that these people will feel supported enough to actually sustain that. But what we have in reality is that there's at most 5 to 10% of people that sustain living upstream with the constant flow of this ideological position of society around them, and being upstream, being outside of the trough. And so basically what, one example is that before we got a ban on battery farming, we did an analysis poll, opinion poll, professional opinion poll, and they said, they found, with questioning 5,000 people of a representative section, they found that 80% want the ban on battery eggs, but 80% of eggs bought were from battery farms. So most people acted against their basic conviction. So basically the conclusion is that this position in this continuum between animal welfare and animal rights is, defines the system, and the full system defines how people behave. And their personal attitude and their personal conviction actually doesn't come into it, mostly. And so what we find then is that if you want to change society towards animal rights, if you have this attitude and you want to do that, then you must change the system. And this system, as we've seen with this trough, basically what you must do is take the trough and move it to the right so that everybody falls into the trough on a further animal rights position, maybe even all the way to the right as an ultimate aim, that everybody is vegan, everybody thinks veganism is good, every product that you find is vegan, then everybody will be vegan, nobody will go out of their way in order to find something else to eat or act differently, if this is sort of the system in society. So basically, you wanna, if you want to achieve animal rights, you take the trough and move it to the right, to this animal rights position. But as it turns out, a system change must always be incremental and safe, because society is not willing to have fundamental changes. And in that sense, it is vital, in my view, that there is this continuum from animal use via animal welfare to animal rights. Because if there wasn't that necessary, then you would have to basically destroy society and rebuild it again. And such an instability activity would be something that that society wouldn't be willing to do. It would be much harder than just slowly and incrementally move this trough. So basically, the proposition is that the animal welfare and animal rights positions can be reconciled by having campaigns to move the trough along this, if you want, hypothetical continuum line. So the system now, as we saw it, with this trough is defined as the state of affairs in society with all its practices and rules, and then the ideal democracy is that that this system is determined or coming up through the free conflict of interests in society. So the free conflict, if you want, of consumers as well as pork producers, as well as welfareists who want to have free-range farming, as well as rightists who want to have an end of pork production. They have a conflict of interests, and eventually an equilibrium forms that I call dynamical, because maybe people are unhappy with this, maybe the next generation thinks differently, maybe there is a reason for that gives rise to new conflicts, but it's a dynamical equilibrium with the new position of this trough. That is how democracy works, and confrontational campaigns now are cold confrontational, because what they try to do is to actually start a conflict about an existing system. And the confrontational campaign is the expression of this conflict, and the aim is to escalate it so much that the new dynamical equilibrium arises, that this trough moves to the right. And what happens is that policy makers and the government actually sitting on the line in between, they ideally shouldn't be leaning either way, but the one party that is able to cause more trouble about their goals and their aims should be able to move the trough more to their side. One example in the animal movement is the songbird trapping in Austria. Songbird trapping is something that happens in a specific region only. So basically the whole of Austria is against it, but this specific region is doing it since 400 years as a tradition, and it turned out that it is impossible to stop it, because the whole area is so strongly behind them, because if someone from outside intervenes, they feel that this is an intervention in their way of life. So by having this position, it seems impossible to actually stop that, because the conflict that arises is always basically leaning towards their side. So it was impossible so far to actually stop it. But with battery farming, it was possible in a very sustained and confrontational campaigns, especially covering free elections, to get a ban on it, which moved the trough to the right, because suddenly there were only free-range eggs or barn eggs available in these shops. Here, this is a picture of a conventional cage. These conventional cages will be banned by next January, 1st of January. And in Austria, we managed to get a ban not just of this conventional cage, but also of the enlarged cages that will be EU standard from next January on. And the cage ban came into place in 2009, and the eggs disappeared from the supermarkets starting from 2007. So today we have, of the eggs, 60% barn eggs, 40% free range. The trough has moved to the right here. But this is what, don't see it very well, but this is what barn eggs look like, and this is what free range looks like. So can we now, if we judge 2 years after this switch, after the trough moved to the right, can we see whether this actually approaches animal liberation or approaches animal rights, whether this hypothesis is true or not? I say it's a bit too early days. What happened, but let's look at the numbers and see what happened. So in 2008, just before the ban came into place, there were 5.4 million hens used for egg production in Austria. Then the ban came into place, they decreased to 4.7 million, the battery farms closed, and then they increased to 5.3 and today to 5.7 million. So we have now more laying hens than before. So that's a fact that we have to face. What happened was actually that the laying hens increased. So, but what happened to the egg export? In 2008 there were 714,000. You see then the decrease and decrease and still decrease. This is an estimate by the industry themselves, nothing to do with me, to the end of the year, by judging how far we've got today. So we have a continued decrease in eggs sold, and the reason might be this year, because cage production has 13 to 15 cents per egg, barn eggs 20 to 25, and this is the cost in the supermarket. Free range 30 to 50 cents per egg. So what we might see here is a decrease in eggs being bought by people because they're just slightly more expensive. And a decrease in eggs being bought might be a move, might be a first sign to a move towards animal rights of basically not buying eggs at all anymore. But okay, so it might be a hint that this conjecture is true. So why are there suddenly more hens if people don't buy more eggs? We have here an import of 30% of eggs at that time. So these 5.4 million eggs produced 70% of the eggs used in Austria. And then here we have an import 25%. So 5% of cage eggs being imported have been substituted with these barn and free-range eggs. And also that is an advance, if you want, from the position of animal welfare, at least from the position of animal welfare, that these eggs are not produced by cage hens anymore, but by free-range or barn eggs. But I also put this line here to show that the price is not just determined by the system, how it is kept, but also especially by the food prices. So there's a lot more economy coming in order to use this tabular as a judgment whether this hypothesis from abolitionism to reformism works. You see that in the last years this egg price was reduced. This is liquid eggs for industrial use that was reduced because the food of the hens cost less. I will end soon by just making one specific point at the end, that for these confrontational campaigns, you might also, as is explained in the book, actually go in the interest of non-human animals beyond what the legal system allows. I want to just give a few examples of democratically legitimate activity that, in order to move this trough, is illegal. There are three basic inequalities that allow for these illegalities. There's this company secrets, there's undemocratic political influence, and the large budget for adverts. These are all inequalities that disrupt the democratic process of how this system, how this continuum from animal use to animal rights is actually being formed. And these are then civil disobedience activities that might well be illegal or are illegal in order to counter these imbalances. For a large budget for adverts, you have, for example, the disruptions of the media reports, the graffiti and flag posting, and these are examples here of such activities as they happened in Austria in order to move the trough. This is disruption of a ram fight, so these were animal fights. This is disruption of a fur fashion show, of songbird praise, and this is of a sow stall. Sow stall agricultural minister promotion. And here these activities as well. Recent activities to try to move the trough to the right. Okay, so I come to the summary. What the animal rights movement tries is an abolition of the abuse of animals full stop. And as you have seen, this is in principle and philosophy that is very distinct from the animal welfare philosophy that has been active for hundreds of years, since the active as a social movement since the mid-1900s, and with the first ideas being earlier. And this distinction is bridged by this psychological and political continuum of animal use to animal rights. And the manner to change the system is moving the trough with these confrontational reform campaigns. And what there is being achieved is that you use sub-goals. You don't promote the animal rights idea from the start, but you move the trough from one step to the next, always steadily and incrementally. The means are these democratically legitimate, non-violent, even if illegal direct action and escalating conflict. And the resolution is a new compromise that everyone has to take for the time being, a dynamic compromise that is maybe questioned by the next generation or by new ideas surfacing to find a new compromise. But in this way, the idea is the trough is being moved ever further to the right, and the problems for this process might be manifold, but one of them that is very prevalent now as a repercussion of powerful interest groups in the world is repression, especially against the animal rights movement and the environmental movement, especially in the USA and the UK, but also, as you might have heard, in Austria, where there was a 3-year-long or 4.5-year-long investigation, 3-year-long direct pressure on us, with even including remand prison and a 14-month trial. So these are all measures that were tried to prevent this move of the trough to the right. Okay, I'll be happy to get some questions. Yeah?
I'm not sure that the animal rights cases actually helped by making the aim of animal rights autonomy, as you claim. If by autonomy we standardly mean state of consciousness, capacity to choose, to lead your life according to deliberation.
Yes.
Because that clearly doesn't make a lot of sense for most animals. And in fact, it's not the sole basis for human rights either, because we standardly say that unborn and newborn babies have rights even though they're not yet autonomous. The mentally incapacitated will never be autonomous, but we still standardly think of them as having rights as well. So it seems to me that really at the end of your continuum there is one basic right, that is the right of animals to live independently of human purposes. And there is no other right there. It doesn't seem to make much sense to say they can have a full charter of rights in the same way we have, say, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So animal rights in the plural only kick in when we fall short of giving animals full independence from human purposes. We need to protect them from specific abuses, so they have various rights on that basis. But as I say, at the end of your continuum, there is just one animal right.
Yes, that's true, I think, yeah. But, okay, autonomy is a difficult term, and people mean or interpret it differently. If you look at Immanuel Kant, then autonomy is something that I think nobody achieves, not even humans do. And my phrase autonomy is, if you want, on the other side of the scale. I think any effect that consciousness has on your actions is what I call autonomy. Any effect that consciousness has. You might have subconscious things that you will have, definitely, that will decide what you do, from the genetic makeup to being influenced in different ways that run subconsciously. But consciousness must have an evolutionary reason, and this evolutionary reason can only be that it affects in some way, beyond these other effects, you're acting, and even if it's in a tiny bit. And from this position, from this definition of autonomy, I think the primary ethical demand is that autonomy is being respected. And these other rights are then sub-rights, like your
welfare or your the right of not being imprisoned is a sub-right that actually is there to protect your autonomy. The right not to be harmed is a sub-right, because if you're being harmed, your autonomy is affected, and the right not to be killed the same. So yes, my approach to animal rights is that there is this one basic right, and there are sub-rights to it. If you say, what about children or mentally handicapped, then I say, if they are conscious beings, then they must also have some sort of autonomy, even in a mild form, even if this autonomy doesn't extend to the so far that they can live in our society in a completely autonomous way. This complete autonomy is not my problem, not my demand. My demand is that they live as autonomously, and you leave them to live as autonomously as they can. Farmed animals probably won't be able to live autonomously, but they still have a right to autonomy, which in my view is very similar to a right like mentally handicapped who can't live in this society. So the right should protect them to be as autonomous as is possible under the given circumstances. Look at society, look at its being and its capabilities. And so I think that it's true that there's actually only one basic right, but it does apply through the board as long as this being is conscious, because consciousness comes with autonomy. Autonomy comes with consciousness.
A question which has nothing to do with my current function, but I was just, what you are describing to me sounds exactly like the strategy of Greenpeace in its first 30 years of existence, since the early 60s. Because that was exactly what Greenpeace was doing at the time to get environmental issues onto the agenda, and also to get, for example, with the whaling issue, animal rights onto the agenda. So we actually have, I think, quite a long record of implementing exactly this strategy in at least the Western world. And I'm just wondering if you agree with that, and if you do, what do you learn from it? Because it's a strategy that has been put to the test, that has obviously given some results, but also, has at some point reached certain limits that it doesn't seem to be able to overcome. Environment is now a mainstream concern, but it doesn't mean we have solved the environmental problems, on the contrary. So, I don't know, what are you, have you ever made the link or thought about?
Yeah, I mean, what I find with animal rights or the animal welfare movement is that there are large majorities of people who are willing, or who are prepared for a certain change, like this 80% wanted a ban on battery farming, but it still didn't come. And you wonder why, because democracy should actually mean that majorities rule. And I suppose with this climate change, it's also like this ecological footprint. If you ask people of that the industry or economy should reduce their CO2 output or equivalent CO2 equivalent output, then you will have majorities who want to protect the climate, but they are in practice not doing it because the system is forcing them, and we can't change the system because of, I think, mostly this. There is a very strong reaction by economy that actually stops the democratic process to develop. They deliberately touch this or attack this democratic process and prevent it to happen with a number of different ways how they do it. Yeah, exactly. These are different ways that I found how they do it. And I think this is a really democratic problem, that democracy is not able to work because the economical interests have such a strong influence on policy and politics, and very undemocratic influence. And it starts, maybe this three below here, it starts with these strategic law cases. We have, as the Animal Association Against Animal Factories in Austria, we have, in the height of our activity, we have more than 10, 20 lawsuits private lawsuits, civil lawsuits by big companies against us, which threaten our existence and which make it very hard to actually criticize a company. Then we have direct repression with these certain laws, and we have obviously a move to criminalize the environmental and the animal movement by claiming that they actually they are criminals in a sense, or a terror threat. And there's lots of money going into this. There is experts being paid in order to smear the activities. And it led to this assault on our movement in Austria. There was years of surveillance. There were 267 people being surveyed in 2008 alone, said the Justice Ministry in a question time in Parliament. So there is a very strong repercussion that comes from industry's influence on politics, undemocratic influence. And I think this is the main stumbling block. The more we have basic rights in order to be able to establish a social movement, the right to protest, the freedom of press, it sounds as if it's there. It is not, in a sense. There's lots of protests, lots of freedom of press activities like investigations that actually occur. In Finland now, there's a trial against activists who have done nothing but film in a factory farm. In Spain, there has been a huge swoop by authorities against the movement which did media stunts by showing, for example, dead animals out of factory farms to the public. And they had also remand prison, and they are now being prosecuted with the criminal organization law. So I think, if you ask me why doesn't it work, I think the majority is behind it. People would be there to enact it, but we have not enough basic rights, because authorities use the terrorist threat in order to combat social movements, especially for environmentalism and rights. This is, I think, what's the problem right now.